The Frozen Ark project was set up to preserve the genetic resources of endangered species of animals before they go extinct.
This is not a replacement for saving the species, it's an insurance. But the insurance is very powerful. I mean, it offers a huge amount of scientific information, which will be manifestly useful and probably in lots of ways that we can't think of at the moment.
That was the voice of Professor Brian Clark, who founded the Frozen Ark project along with his wife Dr. Anne Clark and Dame Anne McLaren. And this is the podcast Frozen Bytes, brought to you by the Frozen Ark project. In this podcast, we will discuss all things conservation and biobanking. I'm your host for this episode, Danielle Ellis, a professional training year student with the Frozen Ark. For our first episode, I'll give you a brief history lesson on the origins of the Frozen Ark. We start our story on the other side of the world, where one tiny snail makes a big difference. The Frozen Ark is a biobanking charity. A biobank is a biorepository where biological samples are stored. These could be seeds or cells. In the Ark's freezers, one of over 100 biobanks across the world, there are samples of approximately 5,000 different species threatened by extinction. When I say threatened, what I mean is those species that are in the IUCN's categories of vulnerable, endangered or critically endangered. But how did this collection start? To quote Walt Disney, "I only hope we never lose sight of one thing, that it was all started by a mouse." In the Frozen Ark's case, it was all started by a snail. The white sand beaches, French Polynesia. Not exactly what springs to mind when you think snails. Nevertheless, this is where the foundations of the Frozen Ark were made. The significant snail in this story is the partula snail, a very unassuming group of land snails, studied for their usefulness in the understanding of evolutionary genetics. Professor Brian Clark, whose voice you heard at the beginning of the episode, and his colleagues initially intended to study the evolutionary biology of these snails. However, they ended up observing the rapid decline of them instead. In fact, all but 12 of the nearly 76 species went extinct in a decade. But why? Biological control gone wrong. Biological control is the introduction of a natural predator to control the population levels of their prey species if they've become a pest. The giant African land snail had reached infestation levels on the South Pacific Islands, and so the carnivorous Florida rosy wool snail was sent out to gobble up the pest species. The problem is with snails, and any other animal, is that it isn't 100% predictable how they will behave. I mean, can you actually predict when your pet cat will have a mad 5 minutes? You can guess what happened next. The wool snail unfortunately liked the taste of partula a little more than the giant African land snail. Quite a lot more actually, causing the unintended, nearly complete disappearance of partula snails from the wild.
And it got him thinking that if I don't capture and take these animals out of the system now, they'll be gone forever. And so that initiated a whole set of conservation actions that resulted in a strong captive breeding programme, both at Nottingham University and the Zoological Society of London, for these small snails, which are called partula snails, and rescuing them from extinction, but also saving their genetic material. And it was during this whole process that Brian realised that unless he saved their DNA, that they would be gone forever. There'd be no record.
That was the voice of the Frozen Ark director, Professor Michael Bruford, filling us in on how the disappearance of a group of island snails resulted in the birth of the Frozen Ark. Founded as a biobanking charity in 2004, the Ark aims to ensure biological material that has been collected from endangered animal species, such as a blood sample or the animal's DNA, is properly selected, organised and preserved, allowing for the samples to be used responsibly and sustainably in conservation management and research. This is done by storing the majority of samples in -80 freezers.
So this is a freezer room, and this is the Frozen Ark freezer, and it's a -80 freezer. So if we open it up, put that down and open it. Oh, and it's freezing, isn't it? You get a real...
Today, the Frozen Ark has a consortium of partners, approximately 48,000 samples, and continues to educate and research the fundamentals and applications of biobanking. Having received a £60,000 National Lottery grant to contribute to the development of the UK National Archive for DNA and Tissues for our very own threatened animal species, the Ark's recent work has been closer to home and a little bit less exotic than those Polynesian snails. Speaking of, the snail that started it all has been successfully reintroduced to their native French Polynesia. As of September 2019, thanks to an international conservation breeding programme, 2 extinct in the wild species have returned home. Thank you very much for listening. This has been Frozen Bytes, brought to you by the Frozen Ark Project. I've been your host, Danielle Ellis. See you next time.